Faulkner taught us that the past is never dead. It's not even past. As we gather virtually to celebrate Juneteenth, it's important for us to remember that it's not past. It's still with us today, and that's why we must gather to remember. I'm honored to be a part of this celebration, and I'm going to be talking about a part that we must remember and that sometimes some of us don't want to remember. The complicity of the white church, not just in the slavery before Juneteenth, but the actions that happened afterwards as well. I was thinking about this last December as I was walking on the grounds of Mount Vernon Missionary Baptist Church just across the river in Callaway County. You may have heard about them right before Thanksgiving. They were vandalized. It was in the local news, in the newspaper, and on television. And as I was walking on that holy ground with their pastor, Reverend Gordon Coleman, he was telling me about the history of the church, its rich legacy of how they have continued to persevere through much. And it was inspiring to see the foundation of that historic building that was built by formerly enslaved persons. They had started worshiping there under slavery, and then after Juneteenth, they bought the land, they built the building, and that church continues today spiritually on that same foundation built by those enslaved persons, on the foundation of their faith and their hope and their perseverance through decades, not just of slavery, but of racial terror, lynchings, and decades of Jim Crow and segregation and discrimination, and now decades of desecration, vandalism. Because the past is not even past. I mean, think about it. That exact same day, November 25th, that exact same day as the vandalism was also the bicentennial celebration for Callaway County. So just a few hours later, a few miles away, people gathered at the county courthouse to celebrate 200 years of Callaway County and to build up a little monument. We did that around the same time in Cole County and Boone County, all celebrating 200 years. But we often have whitewashed that history. Our monuments even look a little whitewashed, celebrating the bicentennials, because we don't want to tell the whole history, the difficult history, the history that Juneteenth reminds us to remember. And we must remember, because if we do not remember, then we will continue to dismember, sometimes even in violent and literal ways. I've been thinking about the importance of remembering the last several months, and I had two Baptist ministers who helped teach me this lesson, Reverend Amos Brown and Reverend C.T. Vivian. The first was Reverend Brown. I had an opportunity to interview him for Word and Way, and it was an honor to talk with him and to have this conversation with him last November. He's the pastor of Third Baptist Church of San Francisco, a historic congregation with a rich history and legacy. And he's been a civil rights leader and icon for decades. He's also the pastor of our now Vice President, Kamala Harris. She's been a member of his church for several years. And so we were meeting to talk a little bit about her faith and then also about his ministry and legacy there at the church and in the civil rights movement. Two things in that conversation about the past really stood out to me. At one point, he talked about a boy who had been the same age as him who was lynched, Emmett Till. Reverend Brown turned 80 since our conversation, and that really got me thinking about the fact that Emmett could still be with us today. That wasn't that long ago. He could still be in the pews of a church, a grocery store aisle, down the street, and we'd pass him and not even know. Because it's not just that it's not past, the past that isn't even that long ago. And then there was another point in the interview that I didn't fully appreciate. I didn't fully understand until a little bit later. And that was when I asked him to tell us, so who was this man that became Amos Brown? Where did he come from before he was the civil rights icon and the Baptist preacher? And I kind of expected him to kind of like start with his childhood, tell us a little bit about growing up. But he instead started the answer to that question by referencing his great-great-grandfather, Patrick Brown, who had been born in slavery in Mississippi. And it wasn't really the answer I was expecting, that he would start all the way back 5 generations. And he kind of walked through and about how his family, his ancestors had the quest for freedom and had fought for the right to vote and had worked to purchase land and to get an education and to build churches to worship in. And then he said, all of that, he was the sum of all of that, of those who had gone before had made him. So the way he saw it, he couldn't answer the question of who he was. He couldn't start at his birth. He had to back up. But I didn't fully appreciate that answer until I started reading the new memoir by the late C.T. Vivian. He passed away last July, was working on his autobiography. It came out in March. It's called It's in the Action. His publisher had sent me a copy of it to read ahead of time, to write about it word and way. And as I was reading it, his autobiography, he starts the same way that Reverend Brown had started his answer to me. This question of, where do I start the story of my life, my birth? Well, Reverend Vivian started with his great-great-grandfather, Al Sampson, born in slavery. And of course, now when he's telling the story of his people, he's talking not about Mississippi slavery, but about Missouri. Reverend Vivian is one of our native sons that we have failed to honor. It is to our shame that our state has no significant honor for this civil rights icon of our generations. It's so problematic that we do not honor him in any significant way in our state. For the first 6 years of his life in Boonville and across the river in Howard County. But I guess, as Jesus said, a prophet has no honor in his hometown, or in this case, in his home state. But both of them started their story by going back to their great-great-grandfather. And for Reverend Vivian, that meant, again, a story of his people yearning for freedom, working to get land, striving for an education, for opportunity, for being able to worship. And it was when I saw those two stories together that the words of scriptures that, as a Baptist minister myself, came to mind, because it's one of the most repeated lines throughout scriptures. Remember, you were enslaved in Egypt. Remember, you were enslaved in Egypt. And then when God makes that declaration to his people, decades, generations, centuries after they left slavery, it's always to change the way they act today at that point. Change the way they treat others, to love their neighbors, to change the way that they react to God and to their neighbors. Because that act of remembering is supposed to shape them. The past isn't past. And when we remember the past, it's not past because it changes the way we act today. But in the white churches, we don't like to remember the past because we're not going to remember when we were enslaved in Egypt. We're going to remember when we were the enslavers in Egypt. I'm an Egyptian. I come from a line of Egyptians in this context of Juneteenth. But when we don't remember, when we fail to remember, when we refuse to remember, then we continue to dismember. And that includes, we continue to dismember the holy text that we proclaim to follow and to admire. In many ways, in many of our churches today, we continue to read the Bible like enslavers, with the same hermeneutic, the same mindset, the same way of thinking about the text. We continue theologies that match the same way enslavers misused the Bible to justify their evil. The same way people misread the Bible to justify lynchings and Jim Crow and segregation, we use to today declare subjugation of women, to endorse an individualistic, capitalistic version of Christianity, and even to ignore, to deny, to miss the teachings about community sin, like systemic racism. and the biblical call to repair the damage, or what we might call reparations. We refuse to remember, so we continue to dismember the text. But you see, it's not good enough to just say, well, keep reading the Bible the exact same way, but P.S., no more enslaving Black people. It's not good enough to keep reading the Bible the exact same way and say, but I guess we'll stop committing genocide against Native Americans. It's not good enough to keep reading the Bible the exact same way, but say, P.S., no more lynching Black people. Because if we read the Bible in the same way that would justify slavery and genocide and lynching and so much more, it's not good enough to just stop committing those evil deeds. We must change the way we read the text. And so we are called, not just on Juneteenth, but we are called, especially on Juneteenth, to remember. To remember. And we are a community whose body needs to be remembered and no longer dismembered. And so part of that is the holy act of remembering, of naming, of confessing, of lamenting. As an example, we did a bit of this at First Baptist Church in Jefferson City, where I'm a member. We have much more to do, both in telling our story, in repairing the damage, but it's a journey that has at least begun. In August of 2019, which was the 400th anniversary of Black enslavement in America, you probably read about some of that in the 1619 Project, a fantastic look at American history, perhaps the biggest hole in the original project. I know that they're working on that better in the book version coming out, is it doesn't look at much on the role of white Christianity in the 1619 and following years of endorsing and advocating for slavery. I mean, we even named many of the ships that transported African bodies over to the colonies and then the United States after biblical characters. John the Baptist, even Jesus. I still struggle to wrap my mind around the idea of chaining men and women and children, often in naked and crowded and inhumane conditions in the belly of a ship, and then when they died from disease or malnutrition, tossing them off the ship named after Jesus. And if we don't remember that, then we're liable to make the same type of dismembering mistakes today. So in August 2019, we decided to tell our story, because I think that's the responsibility of white Americans in a moment like this, is that we need to be honest about our story. Just like Reverend Brown and Reverend Vivian knew their stories and could go back to their great grandfathers and tell that stories, we need to tell those stories in our personal lives, in our communities, in our institutions, and especially in our churches. So we did that at First Baptist. We told the story for the first time. The difficult story that we had forgotten. It's not written in any of our previous church histories, that 4 of our 7 first pastors were enslavers. The founder of the church, who's there to preach the good news, is also enslaving people made in the image of God. 8 of the 11 white charter members of the church were enslavers. The guy who donated the land where the church sits today was an enslaver. Probably have that land from wealth obtained through stealing off the backs of those that he enslaved. And as I read these details during that service of confession and lament, there were some audible gasps in the congregation, because we don't pass these stories on from generation to generation. We've deliberately not remembered. We've had forced amnesia that we wouldn't tell these parts of our story. But we must remember. And we must also remember those that we have dismembered, those that we have tried to forget and to push out the story. And so what we did during that service was we didn't name the pastors. We named them plenty of times, referenced them to call out their sin of enslavement. But we named a few of those that we could find, all of those that we could find, but only a few we could find who had been enslaved by our early pastors or other key leaders. That's one of the injustices of slavery, is that for many, that past has been cut off and lost. Reverend Brown actually talked about this with me in his interview. He mentioned that he actually didn't know a lot of his genealogy. He had just discovered it right before we had a conversation. And he found that to be fascinating, that he was living out the legacy of some of his ancestors, even though he didn't know how they had worked so hard for the right to vote, for instance, until he was 79 years old. Because one of the injustices of slavery and the racial sins that have followed has been to try to erase those stories. We don't even know where many are buried. And some of the few markers that we have of enslaved persons are just a simple stone or rock. I think of the cemetery in Columbia. It's for Baptists, it's a significant cemetery because William Jewell, who there's a college named after him in Liberty, Missouri. William Jewell College is buried there, and it's a state park now because his nephew became a governor of Missouri, and so that whole cemetery is taken care of by us, the people. And there's these large monuments to the various members of the families, their names, and dates, and details in the back of the cemetery, on a prominent spot. Drive right past it. This is just south of Mizzou, next to a Waffle House. There in the back, in the quiet section, there's a couple of rows of small rocks, stones marking the spots of enslaved persons. No names, no dates, but they were enslaved by this prominent Baptist family who still has many things named after them in the state. Things that they built that brought glory to themselves because they stole the labor of those that were buried with nothing more than a rock. And so when we were there in the sanctuary at First Baptist Church in August of 2019, I called out 6 names in that holy space to say it is our holy duty and act of remembrance to remember these individuals who were enslaved by early leaders of this church. Jenny Adams, General Millie, Phyllis, and Lewis. I've said those names many other times quietly in the church because we must remember. It's our duty to remember. That's why we're gathered for Juneteenth, is to remember, to honor those generations, to honor those who went before, and to remember the injustices to make sure it doesn't happen again. Because we are in a moment this year, 1821, it's the birth of Missouri. So we are celebrating our bicentennial later this summer as a state. And I'm sure there's going to be celebrations and parties and lots of things talking about what a great state we are. And I don't mean to suggest that I'm not happy to live here. I lived away and moved back to Missouri. But we need to make sure that we tell that story fully and honestly. If we do not remember the fact that the only reason Missouri became a state in 1821 was to support slavery, then we are dismembering all over those who spent their lives condemned to enslavement, torture, rape, death. sometimes violently. We must remember them. We must remember the compromise done in our name by politicians who said we are going to give new life, new birth, new breath to slavery so that it could have a manifest destiny heading out west. We don't remember that. If we whitewash our history to ignore that, then we will do a disservice to those who lived back then and to ourselves today. Because we can lie to ourselves over and over and over, but ultimately we still hurt ourselves. You can ignore a wound on your body, but it doesn't go away. It just becomes infected. And we have a body politic today that has been infected because the past isn't past. And when we refuse to remember, we will continue to dismember. A state that cannot remember honestly, truthfully its past will continue to dismember Black bodies from Ferguson to Kansas City. A state that cannot remember its past and tell the truth about itself then and today will continue to dismember itself and its own community by making it harder to vote, and harder to protest, and harder to get health care. We must remember. And we must remember because that is in the way that we find what it's really all about. And for those who are watching, who like myself come from a white church tradition, I hope that we will remember that we were Egyptians. We will remember slavery and those who were enslaved because it is a path to help us to rediscover the holy text that we have too often misread. I think in this, from the way that Frederick Douglass put it, and he happened to write these words in 1845, which is the exact same year that my faith tradition Baptist split north and south. And we split in such a way to suggest that the Mason-Dixon line was more powerful, more important than the waters of baptism. And like the other major denominations at the time, like Presbyterians and Methodists, we split 15 or so years before the Civil War, not just predating the national split, but causing it. You see, if the white churches couldn't stay together, there was no prayer for the nation. Because we preached this nation into war, just like we preached this nation into slavery, and we later would preach it into lynchings and segregation and Jim Crow. And so we need to listen. We need to listen to those like Frederick Douglass, himself, who was enslaved and escaped, and then had this to say about the difference between reading the Bible like an enslaver and reading it as one who remembers you were enslaved in Egypt. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, Douglass wrote. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity. To reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. We must remember that, because it's the only way we can move forward as churches and as a community. And so the text that I keep coming back to in Scripture as I think about the past and how it's not really past is found in the Gospel of Luke. It's the story of Zacchaeus. Perhaps you've heard of him. You may even know a children's song. I'm not going to sing it, I promise. But we like to sing that little song in our churches about the wee little man was he. The odd thing about that song is it ends right when the story actually really begins. You see, the song ends with Jesus saying, and I'm going to your house today. That's not the point of the story. The story isn't that Jesus went, it's what happened at the table after Jesus went. You see, at the table, Zacchaeus finally gets it. He finally sees it. He finally starts remembering. He remembers who he is, what he's done, who he's supposed to be, how he's supposed to be treating his neighbors. And so he does two things. He says, first of all, I'm going to give half of my wealth away to the poor. Charity is what we call that. And that's very important and very good, because when we have an abundance and we hoard that while others are in want, naked and hungry and in need, that's shameful. It dishonors ourselves, it dishonors our community, and if, like me, you're a believer in God, it dishonors your faith and God. But that's not good enough. That's not enough. Zacchaeus then does one other thing, and this is the part of the text that we don't like to remember. He then says, I'm going to repair the damage. I'm going to pay back, not just pay back what I stole, pay back 4 times over. He's going to pay reparations for what he has stolen. And that's a number he actually takes from the Hebrew scriptures several times. There are times where people are told to pay back after you have stolen 4 or 5 or even 7-fold. And then Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. It was only by remembering, and then that remembering changing the way he acted, that Zacchaeus found salvation. And I think that's true for all of us, both spiritually as well as politically and as a community. We're not going to be able to find a salvation to move forward until we can remember the past and act in fresh new ways through that remembrance. We are called to remember. And so as we have gathered here virtually for Juneteenth, let us do the holy work of remembering. For those who are white, let us remember in our own context, our own institutions, our own churches, our own complicity in that which we celebrate ending on Juneteenth. Let us remember. Let us stop dismembering our neighbors, dismembering those who have gone before. Let us remember and begin to remember our community, this body politic that is in desperate need of healing. Thanks for allowing me to be part of this program. It is a holy time. Remember as a holy moment of God's liberation and freedom. And it is a holy act to join together as a community and to remember, because the past is never dead. It's not even past. And it's past time that we remember that.